Last year, when the year was drawing to a close, we did a survey and asked you what you'd like, and you said, enough of you said at least, we'd like something on history. So then in the fall, in September, we asked you again, specifically, what questions do you have? And they were sent back to Margaret Kidston, and you don't use the term collate, but she went through them and she picked out the ones that were most often repeated. And that was the basis on which we planned today's program. Now, today's program was originally Betty Childs, Joan Palmer, Jean Curtis, and Helen Gilbert. And I was just sort of there to go along. Margie Burr's parents, or Margaret Kidston's parents, were George and Mildred Burr, and they have been long-time Plymouth residents. She probably could tell you a lot more than I can about them, but they were very, very highly respected. Joan Palmer has lived in our community for a long time. In fact, she grew up here, and when she decided she'd get married, she married someone whose parents came into Canton Township in 1830, I believe. So she probably has the strongest tie to history in our community. Betty Childs and Jean Curtis are both very active in the Plymouth Historical Society. Incidentally, Joan is president of the Canton Historical Society. We're very pleased today to have Virginia Parker, who does it professionally and is going to record our meeting, so that our program today will go into the archives, both in Canton and in Plymouth. We're very pleased with that. At the time Michigan was a territory, there were only 8,000 Indians in all of this vast area. So you can imagine they weren't crowded at all. And they didn't view the coming of the white man particularly with dismay. We were fortunate in our area in that they were not belligerent Indians. They got along very well with the people who came to settle the area. The only thing is that Indians have an entirely different culture than we do, and they don't possess anything. And so if they saw a loaf of bread on a cabin windowsill, they took it if they wanted it. They were very apt to sign treaties over and over again, ceding the same land to a different group of white people. It wasn't that they were thieves, but it was just that their culture was different. Most of the Indians in this area, I believe, were Potawatomis, and they came down from northern Michigan and crossed into Ohio, where the winters were a little bit milder.
The Potawatomi Indians had developed a trail cutting diagonally across the western part of Canton Township. This trail was to become known as Ridge Road and led almost directly to land owned by Alva Smith. Around 1832, he built a trading post at the back of his farm on Fowler Creek so the settlers could trade with the Indians. Records show it was still being used by the Indians in 1876. Alva Smith's farm was located on the Territorial Road, now called Geddes, near Denton Road. In those early days, there was a territorial road in Canton Township and one in Plymouth Township. The one in Plymouth Township was called North Territorial Road. The one in Canton Township was called South Territorial Road. This eventually became named Geddes.
In the absence of an official name for this area, it was referred to by the surveyor's designation of Town 1 South, Range 8 East. And in 1827, finally it had an approved name of Plymouth. And I want you to think of an area. And at the very north part, there was a settlement, and we shall call it Northville. Just south of that, there were two little settlements. One was called Podunk, and that would be the corner of Main Street and Ann Arbor Trail. There was another little settlement at the corner of Main Street and Mill, and that was called Joppa. These two settlements came together what is known as Plymouth Corners. If you look at some of the old maps, our mailbox would have listed Plymouth Corners. South of that, and still in the same Plymouth Township, there are two more settlements, one Cherry Hill and one Sheldon Corners. 7 years after 1827, the south part of the township divided, and that was called then Canton. So now we have Plymouth Township, Canton Township. And in 1897, just before the turn of the century, we divided one more time at 5 Mile Road. So now we have Northville Township, Plymouth Township, and Canton Township. There were many families, because of the Erie Canal opening and whatnot, many families were arriving at that time. And Betty is going to speak to those people in the city of Plymouth. And Jean will speak about the settlements in Plymouth Township. And then Joan will do those that settled in Canton Township. So if you can kind of keep those three areas separated in your mind. Betty, would you talk to us of the first settlers?
In 1825, William Starkweather arrived here from New York State. He and his wife Keziah and his little son Albert. And he had purchased his property sight unseen from the surveyor's map in New York State. And then when he got here in 1825 in the spring, he built a log cabin in what is the parking lot of today's Mayflower Hotel. The neat thing, word got back fast to the east that when people arrived in the T1, T2 South 8 East territory, it was so heavily wooded that they got enough wood to build their house and a barn and outbuildings, and they didn't have to try to find additional building materials. So this area, a lot of people began to come after William got here. In 1835, John Kellogg arrived, and he purchased some of Mr. Kellogg's property and built a soap factory. Didn't last very long, and so in 1840 he built the Plymouth House, which was on the corner of what today is Ann Arbor Trail and Main Street. In 1840, a stagecoach route started from Detroit, had an overnight stop in Plymouth, and then went on to Ann Arbor. And since that time, there's always been an operating inn in this township. Mr. Penniman, Ebenezer Penniman, arrived in 1840, and he purchased some of Mr. Starkweather's property, and he built his house where on what is Penniman Avenue today. That house was purchased in 1941 and since that time has been used as the Catholic Church rectory. He built a school for boys in 1840, just between his house, the Catholic Church rectory today, and where Central Middle School is. And I'll tell you more about that a little bit later.
Erastus Hussey and Alanson Ulrichs Abraham Spears bought parcels of land in the Plymouth Township in 1824. Erastus Hussey did not settle his land until 1826. The first to actually settle in Plymouth Township were Allen and William Tibbets in 1824.
In Canton Township, Alfred Moore, at the age of 21 in the year 1823, walked to Michigan from New York State to see for himself the promised rich farmland. In June of 1825, he purchased 400 acres in the northwest corner of Canton Township. Parts of the original Alfred Moore home, built in 1830, still stands today and is occupied by his great-great-great-grandson, Clifford McClumpha, and his wife, Rita. Ida and Adeline Huff were married December 29, 1825, in this new territory, and purchased land the next spring in 1826 along Warren Road near Haggerty Road. In 1835, after their log cabin had burned, I rebuilt a new home, considered something of a wonder in those days. It contained glass windows which had been imported from England. The house would stand for over 130 years. Aaron and Eliza Palmer settled on land purchased in 1833 at the corner of Beck and Geddes Road. Aaron constructed a home with many unusual features for that time. The basement had 12 by 12 inch hand-hewed beams and double walls, one of stone and one of brick with an air space between. Double glass paned windows were installed, and in the kitchen was a funnel-shaped appliance built over the cook stove and vented into the attic. Well water was piped into the house in a wood casing filled with sawdust to prevent freezing. The house survived until 1980 when it burned to the ground on Christmas Eve. William and Mary Houston arrived in Canton also in 1833, and they brought with them several of their grown children and their families. They settled in the Cherry Hill area, and today there are 2 Houston homes that still stand and are being lived in. Erastus and Calissa Truesdell and their 3 little boys arrived in Canton in 1836. They purchased 80 acres at the northwest corner of Palmer and Haggerty. They had 4 more boys and a girl, totaling 8 children, and they lived in an old red brick home with multiple gingerbreaded gables that still stands today on Haggerty Road. Frederick and Dora Schrader and 6 of their children arrived in Canton in the early 1870s. They settled at the corner of Beck and Hanford, where they had 3 more children. That house still stands today.
As you can see, this area between 8 Mile and all the way down to Michigan Avenue is filling up, so to speak. Many farmers. As people were moving about, they would come through the area of Plymouth. And Betty, Jean, and Joan are going to tell you about places that travelers could rest in the area.
There were lots of inns. Houses would open and close at will. But as I told you earlier, when John Kellogg built the Plymouth House in 1840, and the stagecoach route was established from Detroit through Plymouth to Ann Arbor, people would arrive from Detroit, but you didn't rent a room the way we do today. You rented bed space. You ate on the first floor, and then you rented a space in a bed. And most of the beds were double beds, so you might sleep with someone you didn't know. But people slept in their clothes. They went to bed and got up in the morning and had breakfast then in the inn, and then got back in the stagecoach and went on to Ann Arbor. Plymouth burned twice in its history. It burned the first time in 1856 and the second time in 1893. The Plymouth House burned to the ground in 1857 in 1856, and then the Adams House was built on the foundation of the Plymouth House at the corner of Ann Arbor Trail, what is Ann Arbor Trail and Main Street today. Now, Bodie's Inn was built in 1868 for the railroad workers who were coming to this area. In 1867, this T1 area reached village status. They could meet all of the requirements to become a village. And at that same time, just shortly after the City Fathers had accepted the village status, they received a note from the railroads, the Howell Railroad, Howell to Grand Rapids Railroad in Detroit, asking if they could extend the tracks through the Plymouth area. And so Bodie's Inn, they thought that was great, and so Bodie's Inn was built to give the railroad workers a place to eat and to sleep.
There were no inns in Plymouth Township.
In Canton, there were two settlements, Sheldon and Cherry Hill. And in Sheldon, in 1825, Timothy and Rachel Sheldon, who were traveling by ox cart along a primitive path, which was soon to become known as the Chicago Road. And as evening approached, they turned their cart over and used it for protection and slept under it. The next morning, when they woke up and they looked around, they saw what they liked and they decided to stay. Timothy purchased 160 acres, and in 1831, Rachel purchased 80 acres more, giving them a total of 240 acres. They built a large two-story inn, or a popular way station, that contained a tavern, a large fireplace, and it had clapboard siding on it. It was called the Sheldon Inn. The building still stands today on Michigan Avenue, just east of Sheldon Road. Now in Cherry Hill, a man named Abner Hitchcock came from New York and built a box-like building in 1865. This was on the southeast corner of Ridge and Cherry Hill. The first floor contained a dining room, a kitchen, and office. On the second floor were sleeping quarters. There was a basement with a stable for horses. It was called the Cherry Hill House. Now, business went badly, and by 1870 it was referred to as Hitchcock's Folly. In 1884, James Gunn purchased the building, and the first floor became a general store with living quarters. On the second floor, this was turned into a dance hall, and a new maple floor was installed. Approximately 1917, William West purchased this building, with the first floor remaining a general store and the second floor remaining a dance hall. Square dances were held on Friday and Saturday nights, and many people today still remember this is a popular place, and the building still stands today.
Churches were important in the lives of these people, and the girls are going to recall for us the very early ones in the area.
The Methodist Church began services in people's homes in 1826. The Baptist Church erected a building and began services in 1830 on the corner of Spring and Mill. Presbyterian started service in what was North Plymouth in 1828, and they built their first building in 1833. St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church was established in 1856 in a building on the corner of Main and Liberty. In 1848, property was purchased from Mr. Penniman on Penniman for $75. And that's where a wooden building was constructed, the Methodist Church, and which was replaced with brick after the high school burned in 1916 and a spark flew over and caught fire. The church caught fire and burned to the ground.
There were no established churches in Plymouth Township, although some meetings were held in some of the homes.
In Canton, there was a church at Cherry Hill, and records show that in 1834 there was a circuit rider named Marcus Swift who visited Cherry Hill on his 10-point circuit. Now, in Cherry Hill in 1835, $600 was raised to build a church. Land was purchased from the Crandall Farm on Ridge Road, and the church was called the Crandall Church. It was a frame construction with rough wooden benches. The men sat on the north side of the room and women on the south side of the room. In 1882, a brick building was erected, and this was named the Cherry Hill Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1977, this church became a state historical site. In Sheldon, the Presbyterian Society of Canton bought land in 1844 at the northwest corner of Sheldon and South Territorial, now Geddes Road. They built a large wooden church between 1850 and 1857. And in the fall of 1903, the trustees transferred the church building to the trustees of the Knights and Ladies of the Maccabees, and it was used as a lodge. And it later became a Grange Hall and then was destroyed by fire. Now, right across the corner, at the northeast corner of Sheldon and South Territorial, in 1845, the Sheldon Methodist Episcopal Church purchased land. And by 1858, they had built a brick church there. 40 years later, a second brick church was built there. This burned in 1937, and a third church, brick church, was built by 1939. All three churches had stood on the same site.
The territorial legislature in Michigan passed a law in 1827 that required every township with 50 or more inhabitants to employ a schoolmaster. Now, this person was to teach reading, writing, English, French, arithmetic, spelling, and decent behavior.
There was an addendum to the Land Grant Act which started all this, the rush to this territory, in 1820, that stated when 50 people, now that's 50 bodies, babies, grandparents, children, and adults, when 50 people could come together. And because families were larger in those days, it didn't take but 2 or 3 people, or 2 or 3 families to achieve 50 people, then they had to do something about schooling. And so those first schools met in people's homes. In 1836, William Starkweather built a school building on the corner of Main, of what today is Main and Starkweather. And then I said that in 1840, Mr. Penniman built his seminary building, and that was for boys only. By 1853, the village of Plymouth was really crying for housing for schools. And Mr. Penniman offered to give his seminary building to the village and move it wherever they wanted him to move it, providing girls also were allowed to attend school. He had a daughter, and he realized that girls needed an education as well as boys. This was a real problem now because girls had never been permitted to go to school before. But the village fathers were desperate, and to have a building in good condition offered to them. They accepted Mr. Penniman's offer and moved it down almost where Central sits today. And they got around the coeducation bit by the boys were housed on the first floor and had their own door and their own starting and dismissal time, and the girls were relegated to the second floor with their own door and their own starting and dismissal time. And it wasn't very long before coeducation then they were all meeting together. The building was used, that original seminary building was used until 1884. The first high school class, the first class that was extended to meet all high school requirements, was graduated in 1881 with 7 graduates. In 1884, the old seminary building was moved so that a new brick building could be constructed. And the seminary building was then used by the Plymouth Hotel for storage and in whatever manner they considered appropriate. By 1907, the brick building that was built in 1887 or 1884 wasn't nearly large enough, and it was doubled in size and began to hold classes K through 12. In 1916, that building burned, as I mentioned, and a new building was immediately constructed. While the new building was under construction, classes were held in churches and stores, people who had large cabins, any place, in order to try to continue the students' education until the building was ready for occupancy. In 1824, there was a second building built behind the high school building, and this was for elementary. It was called Central Grade School. And this building was connected, maybe some of you remember, or your children remember, this building was, the grade school building was connected to the high school building by, they called it the tunnel. Actually, it was just an enclosed area, but because the grade of the property was a little bit lower, you did go downhill a little bit through this tunnel, so to speak. And so that connected the two buildings. And people have always used the two buildings, and a lot of people were not even aware that it was two separate buildings, but they were two separate buildings. In 1927, Starkweather Elementary School was built, and Esther is going to tell us about the schools built from then on.
The first school was in a log building in the old Shattuck Farm at the northwest corner of Haggerty and Plymouth Roads, across from the Burroughs factory. Other schools in the township were Kenyon School at the northwest corner of Joy and Ridge. My mother taught there in 1916 or 1917. She boarded with the Norman Miller family on Ridge Road. Norman Miller was the director of the school. Cooper's Corners School was located at North Territorial and Beck in District 4. Allen School was in District 8. This is not the current Allen School. Tiffin School was partly in District 7.
There were 9 country schools in Canton Township. They all started out as log buildings, then were replaced with either brick or frame. 6 of them consolidated with the Plymouth Township School District. 2 Sheldon and Walker schools consolidated with Wayne School District, and Palmer School with the Van Buren School District. Now, of these 6 schools that consolidated with Plymouth, Huff School, which was located at the corner of Warren and Haggerty, and records dated September 27, 1827, show that the District Number 1 of Canton received funds from the town treasurer for $14.40, and they collected from their district $29.77. This ran Huff School for 1 year, paying teachers' wages and expenses. The school still stands today on Warren Road. Bartlett School was south of Warren on Canton Center, and that building no longer exists. It burned. Hanford School is at the corner of Ridge and Hanford Roads, and this building still stands today. Cherry Hill School at the corner of Ridge and Cherry Hill, the building still stands today. Truesdale School was on the west side of Haggerty between Cherry Hill and Palmer, and a small building still exists there today. Canton Center School was located at the corner of Canton Center and Proctor. And this building is next to Canton Township Hall and is the Canton Historical Museum.
As you was gleaned by this time, most of the schools in the Plymouth area were all just one-room schools to begin with. I think schools probably started here because a great many of the people who came to Plymouth came from New England, and New England firmly believed in an education. So that was one of the first things that they started if they possibly could. Schools were small, Teachers were paid maybe $1.25 a day after as the years progressed, and we got up into 1940 or 1840 and 50. The superintendent of schools or the headmaster of the school maybe got $800 or $900. When the school had some money, they finally got the salary of the principal up to about $1,500 a year. But that took a long time. And teachers' salaries rose accordingly. They probably got $2.50 a day for their efforts. School years were not as long as they are now. The children were expected to be home and help, and of course they had to help as far as the girls helped around the house and the boys helped as far as planting is concerned and anything outside. As was previously mentioned, all of the schools were one-room schools until we had a graded school, which was the academy that was established along what is now in the area that's now Main Street. I think we probably as women owe Mr. Penniman a debt of gratitude because he thought that we should have some reading and writing and arithmetic too. It's interesting to note that one of the things that the schools promulgated in that time was decent behavior. Can you imagine what the civil liberties people would do now to Mr. Frisbee, who was supervising, who was principal of the school? He believed in discipline and firm discipline, and he was a big man, and he enforced his decisions. One of the girls that was in school reported on the time that two boys had misbehaved, and he picked them up until they were 2 or 3 inches off the floor and cracked them together. He didn't get very much argument after that. One little boy that was disciplined decided he didn't want to stay in school any longer, so he took off and ran home, and Mr. Frisbee in hot pursuit. And Mr. Frisbee entered the house, dragged him out from under the bed, and told him to get back to school immediately. Discipline was not a problem as we consider it today. The schools grew rather slowly. As it has been commented, the first high school class had 7 members. Graduating class had 7 members in it. And it wasn't until 1936, which is, just 60, not quite 60 years ago, that we finally had 100 students graduating in the senior class at Plymouth High School. Now, I think it was just because Plymouth had established a high school that the people came in from Canton and the people came in from the west to come to school here. Our schools had a good reputation. I hesitate to tell you how many graduates the last senior class, or the class that will graduate this year, possibly Casey knows, but I think it's probably between 800 and 900 students who will be graduating from the Plymouth schools this year. We've grown enormously. As was commented, during the war, we had 2 elementary schools. We had Starkweather and we had Central High School, or Central Grade School, and then we had the high school. In 1952, we started quite a building program, and since then there have been 15 schools built in the Plymouth area, in the Plymouth School District. Our budget, as you can imagine, is the teachers no longer get just $2.35 for their day's work, nor is a principal or a supervisor paid $1,500 or $1,800 a year. High schools were mandated by the state of Michigan in the 1800s, I think about 1887, and it was shortly after that that Plymouth had their high school and graduated their people. Actually, Michigan was one of the first states to mandate that high schools should be free and they should be available for all children in this whole country of ours. So we have a tradition of being interested in education right straight through the years. Against that wall over there is the Plymouth Canton Community Schools. It is now constituted. As you see, it's really the community school district of Wayne and Washtenaw County, because over the years we have annexed a great deal of Salem Township, and we have a little bit of Superior Township, both of those in Washtenaw County. And we also have annexed just a little bit of Northville Township. Because, and when that was originally done, it was, or the whole program started was about in 1950, when the state decided that every child in the state of Michigan must be in a high school district. And we had at that time, I think, 5,200 schools in the state of Michigan. Now we're down to about 500 school districts. So you see we've consolidated and consolidated and consolidated. But Plymouth has done more than its share. Plymouth Canton area has done more than its share of consolidating. We have a good school system of which you should be proud.
Your response cards that were sent back in September, we were so pleased to see so many, and we were surprised at the questions of what were the early cemeteries.
York Street Cemetery was founded in 1845. When you bought a lot, you became a member of the Cemetery Society. In 1891, the Cemetery Society was getting kind of tired of their responsibility, and so they gave the cemetery to the village to maintain and operate. That cemetery you can see today behind the Norgrove home, which was built in 1827 on York Street, and you can, from York Street, you can see parts of the remaining parts of the York Cemetery. The Presbyterian Cemetery was donated. It was land donated by William Starkweather and opened in 1828. Now, additional land was purchased in 1853, 1859, and 1862 to bring that plot of land up to a total of 2.5 acres. It was deeded to the village in 1875 and was used as a cemetery until 1915, when the present Presbyterian Church was given the land, and the church immediately gave it back to the village with a stipulation that the land be used as a park. And then in 1936, when the present Presbyterian building, church building, was built, they began construction, and they ran into some remains on the Presbyterian Park Cemetery land, and those remains were, some of them were transferred to Riverside Cemetery. Riverside Cemetery, in 1877, the village purchased land from Franklin and Esther Shattuck. Riverside Cemetery is out Plymouth Road, and they proceeded to plot out a cemetery. Additional land was purchased in 1921, and that has been, that is still being used as the Plymouth Cemetery today. It's believed that the name name Riverside was so called because of its proximity to the Middle Rouge River.
There's an old Indian burial site on North Territorial, just west of this church. Some settlers, probably from Cooper's Corners, were also buried there. Their remains have since been removed to other cemeteries.
There are 5 cemeteries in Canton Township. Cherry Hill, which is active and operated by the Cherry Hill Cemetery Association. This is located on Ridge Road, just south of Cherry Hill and next to the Methodist Church. It has been a community burial ground since 1834. In Sheldon, land that was owned by William Smith was deeded to the community in 1869 and is now operated by Canton Township. It is called Sheldon Cemetery. It is semi-active. It's located on Sheldon Road, north of Michigan Avenue. Downer Cemetery, Lucretia Downer donated the land. It is an inactive cemetery. It started out on the north side of Michigan Avenue, but when Michigan Avenue was straightened out, the cemetery ended up on the south side of Michigan Avenue. Many graves were destroyed when this was done, and some were moved to a cemetery in Wayne, where they remain unidentified. Kenyon Cemetery, the land was purchased by Samuel Linden from Moses Bradford in 1840. He wanted to move a small burial plot off of his property. It was located very close to his home. Because Orrin and Roxana Kenyon took care of this cemetery, it became known as the Kenyon Cemetery. The fifth cemetery is Knollwood, and this is a new and an active cemetery that's located on Ridge Road, just south of Ford.
March is Great Ladies Month, and we've had many women in this area that have made wonderful contributions. And the three girls are going to mention a few of them to you.
Phoebe Patterson was born in 1857. She served as president of the WCTU, which was established in 1877. And she was the first woman justice of the peace in 1919. She held court in her house. Ruth Houston Whipple was born in 1896, and she was the first woman to sit on the city commission. The village of Plymouth was designated a city. They met all the requirements for city status in 1932, and Ruth Houston Whipple was the first woman to sit on the city commission. She also was the first woman to preside on the board of Michigan Municipal League, and the first woman to preside at a league state session in 1938 and 1939. She was the first woman on the Wayne County Board of Supervisors from 1938 to 1946, and she was the first woman mayor from 1940 to 1942. Kate Penniman Allen, the daughter of Ebenezer, she married a local man, William Allen, in 1896, and she loved theaters. She was just entranced with them, and she built the P&A Theater, named after her father and her husband, in 1918 on Penniman Avenue. And then in 1926, she built a theater in Northville. Well, in 1922, she split both towns wide open because she showed movies on Sunday. And finally, they took a vote. Both villages took a vote, and by a very slim margin, Sunday movie showing won out. Between 1928 and 1930, Kate remodeled the entire Penniman house. She added the pillars that you see when you pass the rectory today. She added a lot of windows, and she added a sunroom. And there was a barn at the back of the Penniman farm, and that barn was moved out from where the school is, the Our Lady of Good Counsel School is now. The barn was moved out on Sheldon Road and converted into a 4-family house, and it's still being lived in today, and it's across from the old Warren Electric Company, where their old business was on Sheldon. Kate died in 1941, and as I said, the Catholic Church purchased the Penniman home and turned it into a rectory, and it's still being used today.
Women in the township, excuse me, have participated in all fields of endeavor. They've taught school, they have participated in church activities, they've worked in businesses in Plymouth, and they have held many public offices.
In the southern part of Canton Township, along the proposed Chicago Road, 4 women obtained land grants. I think this was very unusual for 1825. Lucretia Downer was one, Abigail Sines, who was the mother of Rachel Sheldon, and Sarah Gill. Records show that 3 of the women had no known husband, but they did have children. And in those days, if a woman owned land, she could vote. Another woman in Canton was Zara Palmer, Griffin, Palmer, Depew, Clark. She was married 4 times. She graduated from Canton Center School. She studied library science at the Normal School, which we know as Eastern Michigan University today. She worked at the Detroit Library. When the Wayne County Library System was first organized, she operated a library center from her home on Canton Center Road, which is almost directly across from the current Canton Library. When the Plymouth Library opened in 1923 in the old City Hall, she served as its head from 1924 to 1927. She married Frank Palmer in 1938 and moved into his home on Main Street, just south of Ann Arbor Road. When Zira died in her early 90s, she left this home to the Salvation Army. And last, I'd like to mention a lady who's been associated with 5 of Canton's country schools, Avis Blackmore Waldecker, who now lives in Plymouth. She was raised in Canton, where she attended Bartlett School. Then she taught at Palmer, Canton Center, and Cherry Hill schools, and she sent her 3 daughters through Hanford School.